I'm going to be honest with you. You need to know what's happening in deep sea mining or what's not happening in deep sea mining. Over the past decade, I kept hearing different stories about how close deep sea mining was to becoming a reality. At times, it concerned me greatly because of obvious reasons. And then other times, it seemed like it was never going to happen. Over the past year, things have seemed to progress, and you might have seen more stories in the media about the topic. You've probably seen things about how we need mining and minerals for electric vehicles and cell phones and so forth. And so it's starting to get into that. We're starting to talk more and more about deep sea mining. It's happening for a reason, though, all these stories in the media. And it's partly due to the work of a small group of people that became, with a big funder, that became a resource to the industry on both sides of this industry. My guest today is here to tell us the biggest things that have happened over the past 13 years. Dr. Andrew Thaler joins the podcast to tell us about his 4 years as editor-in-chief of the Deep Sea Mining Observer, and of course, his experience within deep sea mining, and that's how he got his PhD, and how the Observer, how it filled a gap in knowledge to the press on the latest stories in the industry, and it continues to do so today. That's what we're going to talk about on how to protect the ocean. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of How to Protect the Ocean. I am your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening in the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. Today's story and interview and show is all about what you need to know, what's happening in the ocean. Deep sea mining is what we're going to be talking about today. The potential, the regulations that have just been formed, the meetings that have happened, the people within the industry, how are they? A lot of times when we talk about mining, we talk about like extractive types of industries, we think, oh, these are just greedy people who are just trying to get as much money as possible, and they're trying to do something. Dr. Andrew Thaler, who is a great friend of mine, a fantastic biologist and conservationist and oceanographer. He's so good with his hands. He's such a good person to look at for technology and to talk technology with him, although a lot of the times it's way over my head because he knows so much. But just a great guy to have a beer with, to chat with, to have tea with, to travel with, because I've traveled with him. I've had the opportunity to travel with him. But he's here to talk about his life experience within the deep sea mining industry. He started his PhD with it, which I'll tell you about in the interview, and he started following it all throughout his time. And for the past 4 years, he's been editor-in-chief of basically sort of like an industry thought leader sort of magazine, online magazine called the Deep Sea Ocean Observer or Deep Sea Mining Observer. And it's been, the reason why they had it was to fill the gap of information on deep sea mining so that other people in the press, other people in media could use that as a resource and something to quote and something to refer to as a way to get information within the industry. Now, this could be anything from the robots that they built to the conservation issues that they face and what they're trying to do and how they feel about the industry, how they feel about deep sea mining. It's just a great thing. It ended and he's happy about it. So we're going to talk to him about why he's happy about it and, of course, what he's up to next or what he's actually has ongoing and what he's up to next. This guy is always up to something really fun. He's a pioneer within the marine conservation and science industry. I love him to death, and I can't wait for you to hear this interview. He just gave us everything he has, and it's just amazing. And there's going to be more things coming from him with a bit more of a oomph and more of a journalistic, unbiased kind of thing. So it'll be really interesting to see what comes out from him, not only in this interview, but afterwards. So here is the interview with Dr. Andrew Thaler, my good friend. Enjoy it, and I will talk to you after. Hey, Dr. Andrew Thaler, my buddy. Welcome back to the now How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about deep sea mining?
Let's go.
Right on. So you and I, we've known each other for a number of years now. And, you know, I call you, you're my good friend. You are like we are like marine science friends, but we spend a lot of time together. We last time we saw each other, we were in Malaysia, we were in Singapore doing a tour of Singapore, and ended up doing our 500th episode together, giggling like little school kids in a hotel and at the Singapore airport, and it was a blast. And so I'm looking forward to this episode, and because we're talking about something that's really important. We're talking about deep sea mining. And I feel like, people need an update on deep sea mining, where it's at, where it's been, like start off from the beginning, because you've been doing this for quite a long time. Where like the journey that it's been on, the journey that you've been on it, and you just sort of closed up your Deep Sea Mining Observer sort of trade show magazine, essentially is what it was, like an online magazine. And so you were obviously very involved in the process. And so what I want to do is just kind of get to sort of like get the whole story behind the magazine, also, or the Observer, and also just sort of your history and where you think deep sea mining is going in the future, because it's kind of like one of those Bitcoin things. It's up and down. You just never know when it's going to go up or go down or go further down or bust or whatever that might be. So welcome to the show. Why don't you just kind of remind people of who you are and what you do?
So I'm Andrew Thaler. I am a deep sea ecologist, and I work at the interface of how humans use technology to study, understand, and exploit the ocean. So I do a lot of work in conservation technology with oceanographic instrumentation. I do a lot of work in deep sea ecology, primarily around understanding the environmental impacts of deep sea mining. And I also do a lot of policy and education and outreach work. A lot of my policy work is around high seas policy, particularly regarding deep sea mining. So as part of that, I became the editor in chief of the Deep Sea Mining Observer, which I wasn't the founder. It was founded by Arlo Hemphill 2 years before. But I took over the Deep Sea Mining Observer, which is a trade journal for the deep sea mining industry and for more broadly deep sea mining stakeholders. And the vision behind this trade journal was that in 2016, 2017, 2018, no one was thinking about deep sea mining. Very big
Mm-hmm.
things were happening in the industry. Huge policy processes were going on that were happening almost entirely behind closed doors, that were
Wow.
totally opaque to the general public. And the idea was that we would create and run this trade journal with the goal of increasing the public awareness that deep sea mining is happening, increasing media awareness that deep sea mining is happening, and getting deep sea mining more broadly into the general political discussion. And we ended the trade journal. The December issue was my final issue of the Deep Sea Mining Observer. The project has been sunsetted.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when I took over, I was funded to do it for 2 years. I convinced our funder to keep it going for another 2 years, but it always had an end date. So
Right.
I've gotten comments online from people being like, "Oh, is there some deep insidious reason why it's shut down? Did someone silence the deep sea mining observer?" Like, no, no, it
Yeah.
always had a sunset date. We always knew it, and in a lot of ways, I feel like our goal was achieved. Like deep sea
Right.
mining is now very much in the broader political conversation. Is now we see coverage of it in the New York Times. We get coverage of it in the Atlantic. We don't need this little trade journal to keep
Right.
pressure on the deep sea mining industry, because now there is a broader media awareness that this is a big thing, that this is happening, that this is moving forward. So that was the trade journal. For me, I started work in deep sea mining almost 15 years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
My PhD work was looking at the environmental baseline data for deep sea hydrothermal vent organisms in Papua New Guinea, associated with one very particular mining site called Sawar 1, that was at the time supposed to be the world's first commercial deep sea mine. So I was out on the mining boat in 2008. We collected tons and tons and tons of samples. My entire PhD work was looking at the genetic diversity and connectivity of all the organisms that we found at these hydrothermal vents.
Mm-hmm.
I outlived the mining company. The mining company went bankrupt in 2018 and
Right.
closed its doors and sold off all of its assets and disappeared from the world. And their mining tools are now rusting in Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea. Every so often, one of the big geostationary satellites flies over them, and I get a little image, and I can see if they've been
You
moving or
know where
not.
they are.
And I know exactly where they are, and they have not moved in about 2 years.
Wow.
So they
Wow.
are there, and that you can the color is changing too. So they were bright
Oh
white
yeah.
and nicely painted when they landed, and now they're kind of dingy gray and rusty. Um, so
Insane.
that's where I started in deep sea mining, and this is kind of a theme of the deep sea mining story, right? I started in
Right.
2008. When I started in 2008, deep sea mining was imminent. They were going to mine Solwara 1 by 2012.
Mm.
2012 came along, and they were going to mine Solwara 1 by 2017. 2017 came along, and the company was in the midst of bankruptcy and dissolution, and we're being told that uh, we're going to mine polymetallic nodules in the Clipperton-Clarion zone within the next 2 years. And 2020 came along, and we were told that they were going to finish the mining code that is required for any mining in international waters. And we are now in 2023, and the mining code is not done. So it's one
Right.
of these bizarre situations where it's constantly imminent. It feels like it's just around the corner, and it's also constantly being pushed back. So it's
So what?
hard to get a grip on
Yeah,
where the future of deep sea mining is right at this moment.
for sure, for sure. And so, obviously there's a lot of challenges in when you do any kind of mining, especially deep sea mining. There's environmental challenges, which we'll talk about, but then there's also like this company tried it for 10 years and wasn't able to get it across. What were the challenges that they kept facing? Was it a policy perspective, they weren't allowed to do it, or was it more of they just didn't do it properly and ran out of money?
So there were a lot of things that went into that. Some of it was just general bad luck in business,
Hmm.
which happens. You have to accumulate enough investors for a big capital project like this, and
Yeah, that's
they
huge.
had some investors pull out. There was a lot of politics involved. They had targeted Papua New Guinea because one, it had a huge ore deposit on the seafloor in the form of
Gotcha.
Solwara 1, but also because it's all within national waters. So you only have to deal with one country. If you want to mine the high seas, you've got to deal with every country, and especially every country that has ratified the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, which is most major countries minus a couple of holdouts, and also the U.S., who we just have to be different. Um, so also an interesting side note: the UN is or the U.S. is not particularly involved in the policy discussions as much as some of the other countries because we never ratified the treaty. But
Okay.
they targeted Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea had a couple of major political upheavals, so there were a lot of leadership changes during that time, and so the prime minister that was involved in the initial approval of the project was not the prime minister that was involved later on down the road, and
Right.
um, even I think some of the agencies changed, like the mining administration that was overseeing them at the end was a different department and entity than the mining administration that originally approved them. Um, they had a lot of international pressure not to mine because hydrothermal vent mining is a very hard sell. Um, if you look at, deep sea mining is really three different kinds of mining. You've got hydrothermal vent mining, you've got cobalt rich crust mining, which is seamounts, and then
Hmm.
you've got polymetallic nodule mining, which is vast swaths of the abyssal plain.
Right.
And hydrothermal vents are these rare, unique ecosystems on the seafloor that are entirely alien to our understanding of what it means to be alive on planet Earth. Um, they're the organisms that live there are organisms that derive their primary production from chemicals coming out of the vent effluent. They're bizarre, they're weird, they're unique. A lot of them don't have digestive systems because they're living
Hmm.
purely in symbiosis with bacteria that are extracting energy from them. And they're also tiny. So if you took the total surface area of every hydrothermal vent in the world, it's less than the size of the island of Manhattan.
Hmm.
So it's a very, very small area, a very, very distinctive ecosystem, a very iconic ecosystem. And so, from a political standpoint and
It
from
is
a
different.
public perception standpoint, it's a really hard sell to convince
Yeah.
someone that you can mine a hydrothermal vent and brand that as an environmentally sustainable form of mining. They tried. I don't think they succeeded in convincing the general public that it was a sustainable form of mining, but they certainly did try. Um, and then they just ran into a string of bad luck. Like they
Yeah.
got hacked at one point, and someone transferred $10 million out of their bank account through wire
Wow.
fraud. Like that's just, I mean, maybe they could have had better information
Security.
security,
Yeah.
or maybe who knows what actually happened. But like things like that happened as well. So there were probably some business reasons why they specifically weren't able to get it done.
Yeah.
Um, but at the end of the day, and they got really close when Nautilus Minerals was running. It really felt like they were the cutting edge, and they were going to lead the charge in all of this. They were the first deep sea mining company to actually build a mining tool, and they built 3 mining tools, not experimental mining tools, but production
Right.
tools that were actually
Interesting.
going to do the extraction. So even right now, we're talking about there's test mining tools that are out in the Clipperton and Clarion Zone right now, but those are still test tools. It's
Yeah.
there's
They're
no one
not
has
made
ever
for
made
production.
yeah, no one's made the production tool yet. Um, they never got their ship built, which if you have 3 gigantic robots that are going to crawl across the ocean floor, you need a massive support vessel. I think when we looked at the size comparison, it was about the same size as one of the mid-sized U.S. aircraft carriers.
Wow.
So a big, big boat. And
That's
they
a
never
big
got that
boat.
built. Yeah.
That's a huge boat.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's enormous.
Yeah. I guess like you don't realize how big these instruments are. These things that are going to crawl across the bottom of the ocean are
Yeah.
until you start thinking about it's a mid-size aircraft carrier. That's big. That's
Yeah,
huge.
the mining tools Nautilus Minerals made, and I've never actually confirmed this in terms of raw tonnage, but I'm pretty sure they're the largest underwater robots ever built.
Yeah. Jeez.
And they're absolutely massive.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned at the beginning, you always talk about, technology, and then you want to see like that intersect between technology and ocean conservation. Following the mining sort of industry, um, did you ever did you ever get frustrated, angry, or anything like that? That hey, they're gonna mine, but like especially hydrothermal vents, something that you studied. Um, did you ever kind of get into that point where you're like, oh, I'm done with this, or I want this to stop, or things like that? Because I know like you're an ocean conservationist at heart, but you love the technology. But this is kind of like it, like you kind of look at when I worked for as an environmental consultant, and I'm out there doing marine mammal observing for a seismic survey company. Like I'm protecting the whales now, but who's going to protect them later when they dig for oil? Did you ever feel that way? Did you ever feel conflicted that way as a scientist?
So one of the interesting things about the deep sea mining industry that really sets it apart from pretty much every other extractive industry on the planet, well, there are 2 things, but they're kind of related, um, is that the vast majority of people working on within the industry and also working against the industry genuinely and truly are environmentalists. That
Really?
the folks that are working for the deep sea mining companies, they believe that we have a problem in this world. And the biggest problem right now is climate change. And we need to rapidly decarbonize our energy production. The way to rapidly decarbonize that is to electrify the world automotive fleets, electrify our energy generation through wind and solar.
Right.
And in order to do that, we need metals. And we need metals that we haven't really extracted in massive quantities before. We need cobalt. We
Right.
need nickel, which we extract a lot of nickel, but we're going to need a lot more nickel.
Right.
Um, we need exotic metals like tellurium, which make hyper efficient solar panels and are found on cobalt rich crusts. Um, and so they're looking at it as yes, this is locally destructive, but in terms of global solutions, it's either we do this or we lose everything.
Right.
Um, and that is a very compelling argument for
Yeah.
a lot of people. And the folks involved, like, and, I talk to CEOs of most of the mining companies at this point, and you know, they're genuinely environmentally minded people. They are thinking about this as this is our
Our
last
one chance.
best chance to
Yeah.
get us off of the catastrophic climate vortex.
Yeah.
And so because of that, the discussions that happen for the most part are discussions that happen in good faith. And I'm not saying there aren't bad actors. There are
Of
absolutely bad
course.
actors. There's bad
Yeah.
actors in every industry. And there are certainly people who I look at and I'm like, you're not really in this because you want to save the world. You're in this because you want to make a buttload of cash.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but the vast majority of people I interact with in the deep sea mining industry are genuinely and truly on Team Green.
Right.
And they,
Just in a different way. Like
in a different way.
it's like we've painted ourselves into a corner, and now we need to get out of it, and we might have to just like locally
Yeah.
destroy stuff, but we're doing it for the betterment of humanity and the planet.
But because of that, they're also willing to listen to, like, hey, if we're going to do this, we need to mitigate the environmental harms. We need to do this in the most responsible way possible. And so there
Right.
is a much more productive and much more positive dialogue between the environmental groups, the environmental NGOs, and the mining companies for the most part. Obviously,
Yeah,
exceptions abound, but for the
of
most
course.
part, there are good, strong, healthy dialogues that happen there. And like, it's not a story that has a villain. Um,
Mm,
it's a story that has a lot of people trying to do the best thing they believe for the planet,
right. Gotcha.
and
Now,
some people who are a little bit sketchy.
that's yeah, as you'd find in every kind of industry. Now, here's a question for you. So we talk about locally destructive. We don't know a lot about the deep sea. We know about
Right.
certain areas and we know about certain sort of like habitats, like the hydrothermal vents and some sea mounts and things like that. But we've been exploring a couple of percent, maybe if that, of the deep sea. When this is where I get worried is that we're talking about this mining, and I totally get, hey, we need these metals because we need to electrify sort of our energy production. But we don't really know, or do we? Do we know the damage we're causing in the deep sea? Like, do we really, really know if this goes on long term, what kind of damage we're going to be doing?
No, no, we don't. We have some guesses, and there have been some experimental test mining sites that happened in the 70s
Hmm.
that are our best chance at understanding long-term consequences. But, and, just to full disclaimer here, I think for the rest of the interview, we're going to be talking about polymetallic nodule mining.
Okay.
Um, Hydrothermal vent mining, I don't think there is any sustainable way to ever mine a hydrothermal vent.
Right.
They're they're too unusual. They're too unique. Every single hydrothermal vent ecosystem is a distinctive ecosystem that's never really been seen before. Every
Gotcha.
time we go to a hydrothermal vent, we can potentially discover hundreds of new species. Like literally, the ability to discover new species is limited by how much time someone wants to spend on a microscope.
Right.
It's functionally infinite at this point. They're so phenomenally um, rich in life.
Yeah.
Um, Seamounts, cobalt-rich crusts, there will possibly be cobalt-rich crust mining in the future. There are countries pushing forward for it. Cobalt-rich crusts are seamounts. Seamounts are nursery grounds for commercially important fish species. There's an industry-to-industry conflict that I think is keeping that slow
Yeah.
and on the back burner. So we don't hear a ton about
It's
that.
gonna be a lot of negotiations.
Exactly. Where the mining is really going to heat up, if and when they get to start mining, is going to be polymetallic nodule fields. We used to call them manganese nodules. We don't particularly care about manganese anymore, but they're also rich in cobalt, they're rich in nickel, they're rich in copper, which are all things we desperately need for electric vehicles.
Yeah.
Um, and so that is where the big push is happening. And those occur over huge swaths of the abyssal plain. And the argument that a mining company would make in terms of the environmental impact is that we're potentially talking about an ecosystem that encompasses 60% of the surface of the world. The deep abyssal plain is absolutely gigantic, phenomenally rich in biodiversity, um, phenomenally limited in biomass. So that's kind of the trend in the deep sea. You get tons and tons and tons of biodiversity, but the animals aren't particularly abundant in any one place.
Mm.
I believe an argument could be made that there's a responsible way to extract nodules from a portion of the deep abyssal plain without causing large scale damage to the ocean environment. I
Mm.
don't believe we've reached the point where we know enough to make that argument, but I also don't believe it's inconceivable that there is a potential future that involves some form of deep sea mining. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we're even remotely there yet, but I think
Right.
it is within the realm of possibility for polymetallic nodule mining on the abyssal plain that there may in the near future be a compelling argument to be made that uh, we might have to do it because the alternative is, of course, terrestrial mining also impacts the deep ocean. It's
Right.
just one step removed. So at some level, um, if we're talking about to get nickel, we're talking about strip mining huge chunks of the Indonesian rainforest. To get cobalt, we're talking about mining massive chunks of the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Yeah.
Those are both industries that are fraught with environmental and human rights issues.
Huge.
Um, scaling them up to meet all the production demands of the future would likely be a massive environmental catastrophe that would also leach into the ocean.
Right.
Um,
And then the huge human rights aspect as well, or
Absolutely.
violations against human
Yeah.
rights as well. Yeah.
On that token, the time scale of deep sea mining, of actually getting deep sea mining into production where it's making a commercially important impact in the global metal supply chain, is 30 to 50 years.
Wow.
So if they get started
Wow.
today, they would
Yeah.
not be making a significant impact in that metal supply for a very long time. And that means that right now, in the most critical decade for getting climate change under control, deep sea mining is not a player. They're a future play, but they are not a player in the next 7 years. I
Right.
used to say the next 10 years. It's not the
Yeah,
next
it's
10
not
years
10 years
anymore.
anymore.
So I think, the line I like to give is deep sea mining might get us to 2050. It's not going to get us to 2030. And so for that reason, I think there's also a huge opportunity,
Hmm.
because this is really the first industry in the history of exploitation where regulations have preceded the actual extraction. This is the first time that environmentalists and industry groups and policymakers have gotten together and said, how are we going to make this industry work before the industry has begun working?
Yeah.
Like
Which is a
throughout the
good
history.
proactive
Yeah.
approach.
So we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to get it right. We have an opportunity to find a middle ground, maybe not a middle ground, maybe more slanted towards preserving the environment, perhaps, but to
Hmm.
find a way forward that gets us the metals we need without catastrophically destroying the deep ocean
Right.
at the same time. And we
Yeah.
have time. There's no rush. We don't have to mine the deep sea tomorrow. We can take our time with it. Now the mining company will say, well, no,
Right.
we do have to move forward because we have investors, and like investment doesn't stick around forever. And if we can't raise capital, then the companies
Yeah.
disappear. That's not my problem.
No, no, of course not. Now you talk about, like, they met recently, just last
Mhm.
year, I believe, in Kingston, Jamaica, where they've had many of their meetings. And we talked about how people are there to make it greener, but it seemed like this meeting didn't go like other meetings, right? I talked about it in a previous podcast, but you kind of had a bit of a behind the scenes sort of look at it, because you've been involved in this industry. You know a lot of the big players, you know a lot of the environmentalists, you've talked to both of them, you've had relationships with both of them. What was different about this meeting compared to the last meeting, and if there was any difference?
So a few things have been happening, and a lot of it has been happening since the pandemic, and since the pandemic changed a bunch of protocols. Um, and at the same time, the main conference center that the ISA usually uses was under construction, and so they had to relocate to a different conference center,
Mm,
which was smaller and more difficult to manage. Okay. Um, I had been going to, I mean, this has been my fourth year covering deep sea mining, and prior to the
right.
pandemic, I had been to several meetings of the International Seabed Authority. Um, but for the last year, they had pulled my media credentials. So
Hmm.
they had decided that I was no longer an authorized media source for participating in the meeting, which meant I couldn't go and cover it. I could cover it remotely. I could watch the live stream. I could record the live stream, so we have that to reference back. But I couldn't go there in person, which is a bit of a struggle when you're a journalist, because like the value of going to those meetings is being able to interview people and talk to
Yeah.
people and get a feel for the vibe
What's
in the
going
room,
on?
which I
Yeah.
couldn't do. I could
And
only watch the stream.
I find it interesting, the editor in chief of the really magazine that's focused solely on deep sea mining, like named Deep Sea Mining Observer,
Hmm.
to go to a meeting to observe making the regulations of deep sea mining, was not allowed. The credentials got pulled, and it's not as if like the funder is a legitimate funder. You know what I mean? Like, it's not an advocacy group. It's not sort of like an animal rights group or anything like that. It's not something on the fringe. You know what I mean? Like, it's
Right.
not. It is a valid and internationally recognized funder. And here you are, you get your credentials pulled. That must have been super
Yeah. So
frustrating for you.
it was very frustrating. I don't think it was personal.
Right.
I know a lot of journalists who didn't get accredited for going to that meeting, and the reason the ISA gave to some of them was that there wasn't space because the conference center
Because the
was
conference
too
center.
small. The reason they gave to me was that they didn't believe I was an authorized media source, which, okay, whatever. I'm thick-skinned. I take knocks when I take knocks. At least one other journalist I know was personally denied entry, and that's because he published a bunch of very critical articles about the functioning of the Secretariat, which is the administrative
Right.
component of the International Seabed Authority. And the Secretariat is the one who actually makes those kind of
Just
organizational, logistical decisions about who gets to go to what and all that.
right.
So
Right.
I know at least one other person who had been to previous meetings had his credentials pulled. And then, of course, mine as well. But other than that, I knew several journalists who were going for the first time and who weren't um,
Yeah.
given credentials either. So, I
Okay.
think a lot of it is um, the Secretariat is the administrative component of everything, and it seems like they are very gung. Like the current Secretary General really wants his legacy to be getting the mining code done.
Mm.
Um, and so they're pushing very hard to get the mining code done, not necessarily get deep sea mining started, but to get it
Just the code.
codified so that there's some clarity on what the future may bring. And they're very shy about media scrutiny. He's given the, he gave an interview in the Atlantic a couple of years ago, maybe even 4 years ago now, that did not go over well. He's an earnest man, and he
Hmm.
he often doesn't say the most diplomatic thing, and he gets
Gotcha.
himself in trouble and perhaps reveals more than he needs to reveal.
Right.
But it's fine. I love people like that. That's great. Um,
It's great for when you have an observer, a magazine for
yeah.
that.
But I think at the end of the day, because deep sea mining has been this sort of thing that's going to happen, but not really, and it's a little science fiction, but now it's kind of science fact, and there's a lot of money involved, but there's not a lot of oversight because the industry doesn't exist and it's not actually producing any revenue yet. Like they've enjoyed almost 30 years of not a lot of scrutiny. And
Right.
now that things are really heating up, now that there's a mining code that's about to be finished, now that there's mining companies with capital and mining tools and tests happening on the seabed, um, they're getting a little bit of whiplash. They haven't experienced
Mm.
the amount of media scrutiny from sources that are much more talented than I am at teasing out what's really going on behind the scenes. And I think they are, because of that, very media shy. And
Right.
that needs to change because they are an UN organization. They
Yeah.
they need to get their act together. They need to figure out how to professionalize their media wing so that they can respond more thoroughly to these kinds of
Right.
inquiries. But I think the next 2 years they're in for a bit of a rude awakening because there are a lot
Absolutely.
of people from some major outlets that are now paying a lot of attention to these discussions.
Well, and especially nowadays, transparency is key, and
Yeah,
people like transparency. They don't like the opposite, right? They want to see what you're doing, and sometimes it provides value if people in the industry are more worried about doing something about climate change. Like you said, it's a compelling argument. I'm sure you
yeah,
can, to a lot of people, even scientists like yourself, to be like, yeah, okay, I get it. Like, I may not love it, but I get it. This is what needs to be done because we are in a pickle. Let's just say,
yeah.
and
I mean,
and
I'll
and
be honest. I wake up every day, and depending on how well I slept the night before, may determine how I feel about the future of deep sea mining.
right,
Some days I'm like, this is going to be an existential threat to the seafloor that should never be done, and some days I'm like, I think maybe there might be some potential there.
right,
So it really, it is one of those issues where it genuinely is an honest and earnest discussion among people working for the betterment of the
yeah,
planet. And
yeah,
we all just, in some cases, dramatically disagree on what that direction may be.
yeah,
Um,
for sure. And
yeah,
that's going to happen too, right? Like there's a lot of people involved. There are a lot of risks involved, and so they need to be addressed, and so people are going to have different ideas of how it goes forward. So totally get that.
yeah,
Let's just go back to the meeting for a second because
sure.
it wasn't just the media that lost credentials. In a way, they kind of I'm going to say isolated the environmental groups or the observers that were there, that were the scientists and so forth. And the way it was explained to me was before when they were all on the floor together, so that it was easy to access a scientist or environmentalist, like somebody that knows more about like the deep sea mining or deep sea, to kind of walk over and be like, hey, like we're thinking of doing this. What are your thoughts? Like, give us your expert opinion, and then we'll make our decision based off that. But this time it was different. Can you just kind of allude to what was different?
Yeah, well, I don't need to allude to it. I can just flat out say it.
Or say it, yeah.
So usually these meetings happen in the big room, and the
Right.
big room is a UN room. It's like a Soviet era room, so you have those giant, weird beige ear horns that you can hear your translations through,
Right.
and it's designed so that delegations from 167 countries can participate equally in a global discussion. So there are three kind of tiers of participants in these kinds of meetings. Um, there's the council. Um, so the council it's a rotating group of 30 of the member states that are voting on issues that are brought before the council and recommended up to the assembly. And they get to run the show.
Okay.
And that group rotates through. There's then the kind of general assembly of member states, which is all the member states, everyone who's signed on to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. They're voting members. They contribute to the final ultimate decision. And then the third tier is the observers, and the observers are stakeholder groups, NGOs, governments that never ratified the Convention on the Law of the Sea. So the United States goes as an observer, not as a member state. A couple other countries do as well. The Holy See is there as an observer, not a member state. Obviously, if you're the Holy See, you have some influence over some member states.
Right.
And so there's kind of like a tiered structure in who gets to contribute and when they get to contribute and how they get to contribute. And usually what happens is the floor gets open to the council, and then it gets open to all the other member states, and then it gets open to the observers, and they control who gets how much time and everything. And it's all a very cordial and nice process. And for the October meeting in particular, because, oh, I'm sorry, not for the October. Was it the October meeting or the one before it where everyone got really shunted to the back? So it was the summer meeting that was.
Yeah, I think it was in the summer. Yeah.
The summer meeting, because there was a follow-up meeting in October that was a little bit more productive.
Okay.
But in the summer meeting, because things were under construction, they were in a new facility. All the observers were shunted to another room, and so they couldn't directly interact with any of the member state delegations. There was a lot of communication issues. The translation service they used wasn't particularly good. At some key points during negotiations, they lost translation service, which is very challenging if you're not an English language speaker, because most of the proceedings are conducted in English. And the observers really felt like they had been completely isolated from the rest of the conversation and were getting kind of railroaded. They couldn't intervene in the way they could before. They were given time limits and structure limits on how they could address the council and address the assembly. And so it felt very much like they were being antagonized. And then, folks would go up and be like, there's plenty of room in the other room. COVID protocols, obviously, a lot of this is people trying to figure out what to do in the middle of COVID's over, but it's not really over. And do you really want to be in a room with people from 167 different countries breathing the same air for 8 hours?
Yeah.
So it was more logistical than anything else, but it was, those kinds of things where there doesn't seem like anything's overtly antagonistic, but you can tell who's prioritized and who's not based on how things shake out. It was that kind of thing.
Well, do you think it was done on purpose a little bit? Because just the way it worked, not as much press. The scientists and observers were isolated more. So it's harder to go and talk to somebody before that. So maybe it's easier to get this code, done if there's none of that pesky, devil's advocate being like, what if we don't do this? Or what if we do something else? Do you think it was done a little bit on purpose based on your experience in the industry and with the Secretariat?
I don't think it would have been done on purpose in the way you're describing. I think it would have been more like our priority is ensuring that the council and the assembly can get their job done.
Gotcha.
And our secondary priority is to these observer groups.
Gotcha. Okay.
And so it's not like insidious. It's not some deep
Right.
nefarious scheme. But if you're an observer group, it sure feels that way, because your participation is not being prioritized. I
Right.
think what it came down to is not actively attempting to keep observers from participating. It was simply not prioritizing the logistics necessary to make sure observers could be full participants.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. That makes complete sense. So getting to the Observer, getting to the magazine, you mentioned at the beginning that Arlo Hemphill was the one who started. He was the founder.
Yes.
And was it the same reason as you mentioned earlier? Like it was just he found that there was a gap in information of deep sea mining, um, and how do we we need to fill that gap. We need to have something there. Was that his idea? Was that based? That's that the rationale for that?
So the originating idea for the Deep Sea Mining Observer came from Con Nugent, who was at the Pew Charitable Trust at the time.
Okay.
And he wanted to create the Observer as that kind of a media source to really cover in depth the proceedings of the ISA and also the general progress of deep sea mining. Arlo was brought on as the first editor in chief, but
Okay.
conceptually, and he had a big role to play in how
Of
the
course.
original Observer was structured. But conceptually, it was Con Nugent who really built the Observer and got the initial funding for it.
Okay.
And then Arlo came on, and he did a fantastic job with it and really pushed it forward. And then I came in when his time was up, and kind of just tried to carry on the torch and add my
Right.
own flair. And my real focus was making sure more voices were being represented in the industry and in the stakeholder community at large. So I was reaching out to a lot of scientists and folks from industry and folks from concerned stakeholder groups, and trying to solicit articles from them. And my big change was I got a freelancer budget, so I could bring in and pay people to write articles from their perspective, not just mine, and not just a few white guys who spend a lot of time thinking very seriously about policy, and not so much about what it actually means to be a person living next to a deep sea mining site.
Right. Right. So when it first started off, it was like Arlo wrote most of the articles, and you wrote most of the articles, like when you first came on, or did you have other people write articles?
They were all it was always a staff of one.
Okay.
So the bulk of the articles always came from the editor in chief.
That's that's a lot of work. Like how many articles would you put out in a sort of an issue?
So we would do one issue a month, and the goal is to have 4 feature-length articles. So if you've noticed, there
Wow.
hasn't been a lot of writing on Southern fried science in the last 4 years.
I wonder why. Yeah,
And that's
it's
because almost all of my writing effort was dedicated to coming up with 4 unique feature articles about deep sea mining every month
yeah.
for 4 years.
Man,
And the
that's a
final
lot of
the
work.
final year, we were only funded to do 3 issues to cover each of the 3 ISA meetings. But the other three
Okay.
years, it was a big lift. It was a big lift, and by
Yeah.
the end of it, I was a little bit burned out. So I probably could have fought for another year of funding, but
But
like
you're
I needed a break. I needed to take some time and refocus on my priorities and my career as well. And in my perspective, the mission is accomplished. People
yeah,
are people are
like you
paying
said.
attention to deep sea mining. They're aware of it. It's getting a lot of coverage in uh, media venues that have far more reach than my little website and newsletter.
Well, and that's the interesting thing too is like at the beginning of this, even when you took it on, did you realize it was going to have this amount of impact, or even like DC mining would advance in the media's eyes or sort of in the public's eyes this fast?
And that was always the hope. I think a lot of that has to do with the speed with which the industry has progressed.
Mm,
And so I think, if they hadn't made significant developments early in the pandemic, if they hadn't invoked Article 15, which started the 2-year countdown to finish the mining codes, I think the scrutiny would be a lot less and the attention would be a lot less. But because of a few specific actions that really rushed the industry forward, it's garnered a lot of media attention. And I'd like to pretend like I had some role in that, but I'm, not nearly a big. I have a big ego, but it's not nearly big enough to think that the Deep Sea Mining Observer pushed that forward. I do
right.
like to think that I've been a resource to journalists as they've been covering the topic.
Well, and that's the idea, right? You don't have
Yeah,
to be the biggest publication in the industry. You just have to be able to inform those who want to listen, right? And those who
yeah.
want to read it. And I think that's It's
Well, and it's been an interesting relationship with other journalists because I don't have that mandate to get the big scoop, and
right.
because ultimately me having a big scoop is way less impactful than someone who writes for the Atlantic having the big scoop. I've happily passed off, scoops and storylines to other journalists who I know can cover it well
Yeah.
for bigger venues. So
Yeah.
it's been this fun, like, the Observer's never been competitive with other media sources, and I've always been happy to, share my knowledge and my expertise and my sources with anyone who wants to cover the industry, because
Yeah.
at the end of the day, the more people talking about it, the better I'm doing at fulfilling my mission.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, here's a question for you, because I know you're a science communication guy as well. We all know
Yes.
that. You started Southern Fried Science. Obviously, it's been on hiatus for a little bit.
No, we're still publishing.
Still
We
publishing.
publish the whole time. It's slow. It's definitely slow, but
Gotcha.
I never stopped writing for Southern Fried Science.
Gotcha. I mean, that's your baby, right? That's like
It's my baby. It's
that's
my
your baby.
teenager.
It's a teenager now.
It's
Yeah,
old enough to
exactly.
drive.
I love it. I love it. Now, but when this kind of ends, I know you were saying you were ready for it to end. It accomplished its mission, but there's so much moving forward that needs to be covered.
Oh yeah.
Um, do you feel like personally, like you're responsible for ensuring that coverage still gets covered? Because you've had such a your skin has been in the game for so long.
I'm going to make sure that big stories get covered, and I have lots of relationships with journalists now that I didn't have before, and I
Right.
think I have a broader and deeper perspective on the industry. But the biggest change is that I'm not a journalist anymore. I
Mm,
don't have to even present the veneer of being unbiased. So now I get to be a subject matter expert and, tell anyone what I believe is going on, and
yeah.
I get to be a little bit of a blowhard and an edge case on things, and I don't have to have that veneer of not being biased, because I've been working in deep sea mining for 15 years. I've
Yeah.
been doing environmental work in deep sea mining for 15 years.
Yeah.
Um, you know, there are certain aspects of deep sea mining that I think can't ever be done sustainably, and there are certain aspects that I think can be done. And now I'm in a position where I get to be an advocate rather than
Right.
an observer.
Right. Gotcha. So now, you're always up. We were just talking before we recorded things that you were up to. You're always up to something innovative and something really, really interesting. Now that a lot of the time, and you've had like a month or two, month and a half, of not writing for and not worrying about sort of building the relationships or getting the stories out as much. Um, what projects are you up to that you can share with us, like moving forward, and with that is, what would you like to do now? Deep sea mining or no deep sea mining, like what are you doing now? Like, share a couple if you can, and then what would you like to do?
So I have a couple big projects that have been ongoing. One of which we talked about is the Dominica Distillery, and I think, have you had Jake Levinson on to talk about it?
You know what, I tried to get him, he wasn't ready, so soon, I'm hoping
Okay.
soon. Yeah, yeah.
Well, if he wasn't ready, I won't give too many details on that. But we are building a conservation first distillery in Dominica that is uh, going to be owned by a nonprofit that does sea turtle conservation work. And so the profits from the distillery go directly to supporting the organization, not like through a donation structure, but
Right.
through a direct ownership structure. And we are in the process of building it out. And there is rum that is aging right now.
Very nice. That's
So
awesome.
I may be able to go out in a few months and join in for the first uncorking. But that is a project that's been very, very dear to me for the last 3 years now, and I'm really hoping that we have something great to talk about in about 6 months.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely have you guys on for that. That's something, it's like a social enterprise, which we're seeing a lot of these types of things pop up. Um, and watching the journey of both of you kind of go through this from the beginning to like what's closer to I guess the beginning of the actual distillery, but like from conception to building it out, has been such an interesting story to watch, and to be able to observe. So I'm looking forward to having you guys back on to be able to be able to talk about it, and hopefully one day go down there and try it. I think
I
is
think we're
what
gonna
we're
have to
going to
get
have
you
to
out to
do that.
Dominica.
I think
Is the
so.
answer to that?
I think so. Absolutely. Maybe see some sea
Yeah.
turtles and so forth too. Um, so and okay, so that's one of the projects you're now. What do what's going on in that brain that you can share without giving away too much that you would like to accomplish next or down the road?
So I have recently inherited my PhD advisor's sample collections, some
Oh,
from the mining sites, some from other deep sea sites. And one of the things I'm eager to test out in the next coming months, because sunsetting the Deep Sea Mining Observer, the thing I realize is that I'm a deep sea biologist at heart, and I want to do some deep sea research. And
mm-hmm.
it's been
In a while,
8 years since I've done any direct deep sea research. I've done a few little projects, but
right?
haven't really had my chance to get into it. So um, I'm really interested in starting a global survey of microplastics in the tissue of deep sea hydrothermal vent organisms. And we have the samples to really do kind of a global assessment of that.
Are you
Um,
worried about what you're going to find?
I'm not looking forward to it right now. We expect to find microplastics. At this point,
Right.
you're finding microplastics in lots of different species. Some of these samples are quite old. They go back all the way to the early 2000s. So, and some of them are from very, very far offshore.
Right.
And so it's going to be really interesting to see if there's a time horizon
Mm,
or a geographic pattern with microplastic uptake. And then also looking at how different species are uptaking microplastics. Are the vent dependent organisms, the one that are actually harnessing chemical energy from the vent plumes, um, are they accumulating not bioplastics, microplastics
mhm.
in their tissues? Because that would be a phenomenal occurrence because they don't have digestive systems. They're not eating anything
Right.
from
So how
around
are they
them. They're
getting it
they're
in there?
pulling
Yeah.
chemistry out of the plume. So where would it be coming from?
Yeah.
So we're very early into that. I'm actually probably going to launch an experiment crowdfunding
Yeah.
thing imminently to get some funding to do the pilot study on that.
Yeah.
And that's really it's kind of tabula rasa for me. I don't know what we're going to find.
Right.
It's like, it's very rare to go into a scientific question and be like, I honestly do not know what the answer is going to be. I have a couple of hypotheses, but I don't know which one's even going to be remotely right.
Right.
And so it's really kind of a tantalizing little expedition for me to go out there and see, ask, baseline questions are the kinds of questions I love because it's,
Yeah.
what's actually there, what's actually going on, not how is X affecting Y affecting Z, but like, you know, one of these days we're going to have to compare how much the world has changed to what it was before.
Yeah.
And if we don't have those baselines, we can never do it. So,
I also think,
establishing a microplastic baseline for deep sea vent organisms would be a
yeah.
really phenomenal challenge for me.
And I also think just sort of quantifying it and just letting the people know, like letting, like, because
Yeah.
you have this relationship with sort of a general audience, like your Southern Fried Science audience and your audience that you've built through multiple facets. And do you think people are going to be like, wow, it actually does get into the deep sea? Like, do you think people believe that microplastics get into the deep sea? Do
I
you think they have
think that
that ability to sort of think about that?
I think that every time we put out a picture of a can of spam from the bottom of the Mariana Trench, hundreds of thousands of people who never even think about what we do in the deep ocean are suddenly exposed to this entirely new and simultaneously entirely relatable phenomenon.
Yeah.
So I think, finding microplastics in vent organisms is absolutely a way that's going to tie people to, here's an ecosystem you've never seen. Here's an
Yeah.
ecosystem you're never going to see. Here's an
Right.
ecosystem we didn't know existed 50
Yeah.
years ago. I used to say 30 years ago, but now it's
It's
been
50.
longer.
It's been longer.
Um, this is a place that fundamentally redefined how we understand what it means to be alive on planet Earth. And the plastics that we started producing 100 years ago are already seeping into like the fibers of these organisms. Like it is now part of the ecosystem in an inextricable way. Um, and from a storytelling standpoint, that's a profoundly powerful story to tell.
Absolutely.
Um, you
Absolutely.
know, how much it will galvanize change, I don't know. At some level, environmental scientists and conservation scientists are archivists of the apocalypse. So
Yeah.
we get to document things, so I can tell my kid how cool a hydrothermal vent was.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
which brings up the other thing, my other big project. So, uh, like you said, I've been a comms guy for a long time. I've been
Yeah.
doing lots of science outreach, and there was a moment during the pandemic when resistance to even the most basic scientifically guided recommendations was so strong that it really felt like all the outreach in the world isn't going to change these kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we can spend all of our effort trying to convince lawmakers to do the right thing. But what if instead of doing that, we just became lawmakers? So, over the last few years, I've been looking into uh, various municipal structures within my local communities and finding the places where I could be the most effective, contribute the most, and help the most. I started off by joining the board of directors for our library system.
Okay.
So helping support our libraries and raise funds for our libraries and making sure that a lot of the political winds that are blowing against free access to knowledge and information don't impact our local libraries and fighting for that. Um, and during that time, we also campaigned to get our town to create a climate change commission, a local commission of town residents who were empowered to pursue uh, infrastructure solutions to build climate resilience in our town. Um, and I,
That's
I was one of
amazing.
the founding members of the St. Michael's Climate Change Commission. I'm the commissioner of climate change. Um,
I think that's pretty good role for you.
I'm a commissioner of climate change. There's
Right.
7 of
Right.
us.
Yeah.
I drew the short straw because the 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 terms are staggered so that you don't have total turnover all the time. And I drew the short straw and had a 1-year term,
Okay.
and then was reelected in December. So
Nice.
I've got another 4 years
Congratulations.
on the Climate Change Commission, and it's an infrastructure commission. We're doing infrastructure studies to identify critical areas in town. We are going after grant funding to do engineering studies with the ultimate goal of doing things like raising roads
Yeah.
and building berms and putting in wetlands and getting rid of impermeable surfaces so that when we do have high tide flooding, which we have a lot of high flooding
Yeah.
now. I live in a coastal area. Um, we've built the infrastructure so that the town itself can endure into 2050.
Yeah.
Um, so that's been my big project, is
I
actually
love
building
that.
things.
You know what? This makes me so happy because I'm trying to remember when we had this conversation. I don't know if it was in Newfoundland or Malaysia, Singapore, plane on the way to LAX, or even LAX for like 10 hours when we were staying, or even in San Francisco when we walked around for at Berkeley for like 9 hours. But I remember you saying that, you were moving to St. Michael's, and you were like, you know
Mm.
what? One thing that I've always wanted to do is to be able to advocate locally, and be able to be like just be a person who just goes out and looks out for the town, and do more like local issues. And you're doing it now. And that's
Yeah.
amazing, because it's one thing to say it, but the other thing is to actually do it, because that takes time. That takes a lot of
Yeah.
time, building up trust, getting into the right circles, and starting things, and offering your expertise, and working with other people, and things like that. And I'm so proud of you, man. That's awesome that you're doing this, and you continue to do this. This is huge. And I think it's not a lot of people want to get into that type of I guess career path in a way. And it's a difficult road to take. But I remember when I was graduating with my undergrad at convocation, one of our professors got up and he said, more scientists need to be into politics. They need to run for office. They need to be on these commissions, or start these commissions and be on these commissions. And not only from a science perspective, but obviously from like an information perspective, like you're doing as well, right? Protecting children's rights, and communities' rights to be able to read the books that are out there to read, that are important. So I'm so proud of you, man. That's awesome. As a friend, that's really
Thank you.
good. I love that, to
Yeah,
see
and
that come to fruition.
the reality is, so 2016, something happened in 2016. And there was organizations pushing for scientists to run for Congress. And I think we talked about that one
Yeah,
because I
we
thought that
did.
was a terrible idea.
Right.
Because national politics is theater. You have to be a politician. You have to be very
Yeah.
good at the theater aspect of things. But I'll tell you what, local politics, you don't have to be a politician. Local politics is where expertise can be rewarded.
Right.
Um,
Gotcha.
Sometimes it's thankless. They're voluntary positions, so you're not getting compensated for anything.
Right.
Which means it's people who really have vested interests in things. And, it's a place where, you identify the right positions where you can make a difference. And maybe it's a planning and zoning commission.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a wetlands commission. Maybe it's, a lot of towns will have a conservation commission. Maybe it's the town council or the city council or the county council. Um, if you're in Louisiana, maybe it's the parish coroner where you can
Mhm.
make the biggest impact. Um, and so, being able to identify positions in the municipality that most directly impacts your life. Because, yes, what Congress does is a big deal, but what your town government does, what your county government does, that's the thing that actively impacts how you live your life on the day
Yeah.
to day. And so, we can get involved in all those. And
Yeah.
that's the place where people with expertise should really be hanging their hat.
Yeah. I love it. I love that because especially, you don't want your town, city, place where you live to be that city and town and place where you live to be like, oh, we should have done this in the past. Like we should
Yeah.
have raised roads, built bridges, put in wetlands and not take them out and stuff before it's too late. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? And it's not far off from being too late for a lot of communities, right? And so
And I got to tell you, raising 300 yards of road by 4 feet is a phenomenally complicated undertaking. It's unbelievable how many things go into raising a road. It's been an incredible learning experience for me.
I could just imagine. Yeah, it's amazing. Well, Andrew, this has been a very, as usual, and what I expected, rewarding podcast episode. I really appreciate you coming in and offering your history, your experience, your expertise in deep sea mining. Good luck with all the political stuff and all the commission stuff and helping your community. And I hope it inspires the people who are like listening to this now, and hopefully one day we'll be able to drink the rum from Dominica, as we listen to this
Absolutely.
podcast.
Not
Well,
hopefully, we will.
we will be doing that at one point. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Andrew, for joining us on How to Protect the Ocean podcast. This is actually the first time I've had Andrew on since I've changed the name of the podcast, so that was kind of fun. I actually didn't tell him until right before. He was pretty cool about it. He liked the name, and I told him why I changed it. Just I want to give people more of a direction of where this podcast was when they read the title. I found that Speak Up for the Ocean Blue wasn't necessarily giving the right kind of vibe that I wanted to give. So anyway, thank you, Andrew, for coming on. I thought this episode was so enriching. At the beginning of the year, one of my focuses was to start talking about specific industries that we didn't really have a lot of information on. Now, I wanted to be a little bit more of a narrative voice, but Andrew provides such great information, and I'm not used to doing narrative voices, that this I found was such a great show because it provided a pretty unbiased look at what the industry was like. He talked about how people in the industry, truly believe they are protecting the ocean and they're protecting the planet by reducing emissions, using transportation and environment and electric vehicles. But they know they have to do this deep sea mining. They know that there's potential danger. They know that there are a lot of unanswered questions, but they feel like they're backed into a corner. We're all backed into a corner, and things need to progress a lot faster. And unfortunately, I assume they just think that some sacrifices have to be made or some risks are better than others when it comes to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, and this was the best way to do it. I also found it interesting how he mentioned that even if we started production today, like started deep sea mining today, it would take probably the next 50 years for that ore and those minerals to be able to be into production regularly. So that also concerns me. Is it's going to take a long time for this thing to get started at a phenomenal rate, at a rate that we need to be able to reduce our stuff. So obviously we still have to do something. Deep sea mining is not a short-term answer. It's a long-term answer. There's still a lot of questions that need to be answered, but it may at this point be one of our only choices, and we may need to follow that. So I thought that was a very interesting outlook on, and Andrew is big into conservation, big into, he talks about what he thinks would be good mining, what he thinks would be bad mining, like hydrothermal vents would not be a good mining position. The nodules might be a better position because they're much more bountiful, and they're more vast, and it's like a big plains area. So I thought that was really interesting to talk about that. But then talking about, hey, there are a lot of human rights issues that happen here. There are a lot of environmental rights that are going against, and we need to be able to identify those and be able to do the best we can. I thought it was interesting as well how he thought it was interesting that people are looking out for regulations. And then, of course, talking about the meeting, how some things happen. There were coincidence, but you never know, right? And he got his credentials pulled, and he wasn't happy about that. So there's a lot of things that are going out there that he presents on both sides, and I really thought that was interesting to hear and refreshing to hear from somebody on a particular issue that is quite controversial. So I'd love to know what you think about the issue of deep sea mining, about this episode, about the positions that Andrew took, and your position as well. Hit me up on Instagram, DM me at How to Protect the Ocean. That's at How to Protect the Ocean. I'd love to have that conversation with you. If you want to email me personally, all you have to do is go to speakupforblue.com, go to contact us. Once you email that form, you fill out that form, that email goes right to my personal email or my business email. So I get to see that right away. So I want to thank you so much for joining us on this episode, this great episode of How to Protect the Ocean. I want you to have a great day. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.